September 11th, 2001. A clear blue morning that turned into smoke, fire and ash. Nearly 3,000 lives were lost in a single day. Families torn apart. A skyline forever altered. A generation marked by a single morning that they would never forget. But what lingered long after the rubble was cleared wasn't just grief. It was fear, and fear is contagious. It spread faster than fire, burrowed deeper than grief, and reshaped our society more permanently than any building ever could. In the weeks that followed, America didn't just mourn, it transformed. Leaders told us safety had to come first. The public vehemently agreed. And in that moment, a trade was made. One that most of us didn't fully understand at the time. We got a little more safety for a little less freedom. A bargain struck in the heat of panic. One that has defined every day of our lives now for more than 2 decades. This is the story of how 9/11 didn't just bring down the towers. It built a surveillance state. Welcome, this is Info Inquisitive. Here we break down the scandals, the psychology, and the systems that shape our world. Today, we explore how 9/11 didn't just change the skyline, it transformed our world. From the Patriot Act to the TSA to mass surveillance programs most of us never knew existed. This is the story of the freedom we traded for the promise of safety. In the hours after 9/11, America felt small, vulnerable. It wasn't just the collapse of towers in New York. It was the collapse of certainty. The feeling that home was no longer safe. That the oceans could not protect us. And that our lives would never be the same again. All in an instant, everything we thought we knew about our place in the world was gone. The grief was unbearable. Nearly 3,000 lives were lost that morning. Families pleading, searching for loved ones who would never come home. But what lingered just as heavily as grief was fear. Fear that it could happen again. Fear that no place was safe. And that fear is powerful. It spreads faster than fire, and it drives people to accept things they would normally resist. President George W. Bush addressed the nation on that very night, telling Americans, "Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America." It was a call to resilience, but also the start of a message that would shape policy, that to protect America, extraordinary measures were now justified. Days later, standing at the National Cathedral, Bush's words carried both comfort and warning. This nation is peaceful, but fierce when stirred to anger. Our unity is a kinship of grief and a steadfast resolve to prevail against our enemies. It was a message of unity, but unity around fear, anger, and the promise of retaliation. And Congress responded with near-unanimous urgency and kind. On September 14th, the authorization for use of military force, essentially a blank check for war, passed 98-0 in the Senate and 420-1 in the House. Only one lawmaker, Barbara Lee, voted against it. She warned, "As we act, let us not become the evil that we deplore." But in a climate of raw grief and fury, her words were drowned out. Fear had already set the course. In the weeks that followed, fear translated into action everywhere. Countries around the world froze assets, tracked financial flows, and pledged support for a new war on terror. At home, Americans lined up for armed guards at airports, welcomed new restrictions, and embraced visible signs of security. Because safety now mattered more than freedom, at least in the moment. And this raises the central question that will guide the rest of this story. Was this protection or opportunism? In that moment of national trauma, were leaders truly acting to keep people safe? Or were they exploiting fear to expand their own power? Maybe it was a mix of both. But either way, the consequences would reshape America for decades to come. Just days after 9/11, Congress passed the Patriot Act with overwhelming speed and support. The Senate approved it in a single night. The House followed with near-unanimous votes. The message was clear. Freedom could wait, but security couldn't. In plain terms, the Patriot Act was built on the idea that the government needed the most powerful tools to stop terrorism before it happened again. So it removed many of the legal hurdles that once protected our privacy. For example, FISA, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, allowed for secret surveillance. Courts could issue warrants in private without public hearings for spying on individuals. There was no transparency, just approval in secret. The law also expanded permissible searches. Libraries, books, even the internet. Your internet provider could be asked to hand over your browsing history without a search warrant. All because foreign intelligence now included known or suspected terrorists at home. Sneak and peek searches became legal too, meaning law enforcement could enter your home, examine your property, and leave, without telling you until much later. Not because you were a suspect, but to avoid tipping off potential wrongdoing. In the name of national security, we watched legal protections that took decades to build erode away in hours. So how did such sweeping changes happen so fast, and with such bipartisan agreement? Fear, pure and simple. In the darkest moment of national trauma, any question about liberty seemed unpatriotic. People wanted action, not complex legal debates. Senator Pat Leahy, a former judiciary chairman, warned that we don't want to see the system change so much that we lose our liberties to protect them. But even he acknowledged that withholding powers in the name of due process might be historically naive. Meanwhile, leaders like Senator Joseph Lieberman framed it as urgent and defensible. This bill is not perfect, but it must be passed. Psychologists call this the security paradox. When we feel scared enough, we willingly trade our own freedoms, often without realizing it. Because liberty feels abstract, but fear feels immediate. And that's what the Patriot Act gave us. The illusion of control, the comfort of being protected, at the cost of the very freedoms we believed were inviolable. If the Patriot Act was about what the government could do in secret, the creation of the TSA was about what the public would see and feel every single day. Before 9/11, airport security was almost casual. Families could walk right to the gate to see loved ones off. Shoes stayed on, liquids weren't questioned. There were metal detectors, but the system was fragmented. Some airports even used private contractors. After 9/11, that world vanished overnight. In November 2001, the Transportation Security Administration was created. Its mission was to unify airport screening under federal control and make sure nothing like 9/11 could ever happen again. And almost instantly, the experience of flying in America became a symbol of the new era of fear. Shoes off, belts off, bottled water banned. Body scanners, random pat-downs, armed guards standing by the gates. What had once been a convenience became a ritual. And like all rituals, it carried meaning. A message that you were safer now because the government was watching closely. But here's the truth. Much of it was about appearances. Experts call it security theatre. Visible, dramatic measures that don't always make us safer, but convince us that something is being done. And the numbers back that up. In 2006, a Government Accountability Office investigation admitted that TSA agents were failing to detect banned items during undercover tests. Nearly a decade later, in 2015, the Department of Homeland Security ran its own tests and found that 67 out of 70 times, inspectors smuggled fake weapons and explosives past TSA checkpoints. That's a 95% failure rate. Think about that. The very system built to make us safer was riddled with cracks. But effectiveness almost didn't matter. What mattered was perception. After the trauma of 9/11, Americans didn't need perfect protection. They needed visible protection. Seeing nail clippers confiscated, shampoo bottles tossed, or random passengers pulled aside sent a psychological signal. The danger was being managed. The irony: even as these measures gave comfort, the inconvenience itself became part of the performance. Long lines, random checks, and strict rules reinforced the idea that something important was happening. The ritual of delay became the price of safety, and all of it came at an enormous cost. Billions of taxpayer dollars every year. Countless hours lost to security lines. And perhaps most importantly, a generation raised to accept that constant surveillance and intrusion are normal. That government agents rifling through your bag or scanning your body is just the price of living in a post-9/11 world. The TSA wasn't just about preventing another attack. It was about conditioning, teaching an entire nation that safety could only be guaranteed if freedom was inconvenienced, and that liberty could be reshaped into ritual. While the TSA made security visible, another transformation was happening in secret, one that most Americans wouldn't learn about for more than a decade. After 9/11, the National Security Agency was given extraordinary powers under the Patriot Act. Section 215 allowed the bulk collection of phone records, not just from suspected terrorists, but from ordinary Americans. Who you called, when you called, how long you talked. billions of records, vacuumed up in the name of preventing another 9/11. But it didn't stop with phone calls. The NSA expanded into internet data too. Programs like PRISM, revealed by Edward Snowden in 2013, showed how the government tapped directly into the servers of companies like Google, Apple, and Facebook. Emails, chats, and photos, all accessible through secret warrants approved by the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, or FISA, a court that operated entirely in secret, with no public hearings, no defense attorneys, and almost no denials of government requests. President Bush defended the surveillance programs, saying, "If somebody from Al-Qaeda is calling you, we want to know why." To many Americans still living in fear of another attack, that sounded reasonable. But the reality was much broader. The government wasn't just tracking terrorists. It was building the largest surveillance infrastructure in human history, one that could monitor everyone all the time. And here's the chilling part. Once governments gain powers like this, they almost never give them back. Even after the immediate shock of 9/11 faded, the surveillance state didn't shrink. Instead, it grew. New technologies, new databases, new ways to track not just enemies abroad, but citizens at home. Psychologists call this the availability heuristic. When a threat is fresh in our minds, like the image of planes hitting towers, we overestimate the risk of it happening again. And so, in our fear, we accept policies that we would never have allowed in calmer times. Policies that, once entrenched, become the new normal. This is the paradox of post-9/11 America. The most visible security measures were the least effective, and the most effective, or at least the most far-reaching, were the ones we couldn't even see. By the mid-2000s, the surveillance state was no longer temporary. The Patriot Act had been renewed, the TSA was a permanent fixture, and the NSA's surveillance programs continued to grow in scope and sophistication. And what's most striking is how little resistance there was. Why? Psychology. We don't evaluate risk rationally. We overestimate rare and catastrophic threats, like terrorism, while underestimating the risks we face every day. Statistically, in 2001, an American was more likely to die from drowning in a bathtub than from a terrorist attack. But try telling that to a country still reeling from the sight of falling towers. Fear made terrorism feel infinite, immediate, and everywhere. And politicians understood this. That's why measures that once seemed unimaginable suddenly felt inevitable. Consider the no-fly list. A secret government list of suspected terrorists created after 9/11 that grew so large it eventually contained tens of thousands of names. Many of them were added without explanation, without due process, and without any way to challenge the designation. Innocent Americans found themselves stranded at airports, unable to travel, because of an opaque system that offered no transparency. Or take the case of the New York Police Department's demographics unit. In the years after 9/11, the NYPD mapped entire Muslim communities across the city, sending informants into mosques, restaurants, and bookstores. Not because individuals were suspected of crimes, but because they were Muslim. Years later, the program was quietly shut down, having produced zero terrorism leads. But for over a decade, people lived under suspicion for no reason other than their faith. This is what Benjamin Franklin warned about more than 200 years ago. Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. But in practice, the trade-off isn't temporary at all. Laws passed in emergencies rarely expire when the crisis ends. The Patriot Act was designed as a response to 9/11, yet its provisions were renewed multiple times. And even when some sections lapsed, others were absorbed into new legislation under different names. Once a government has the power to watch, it rarely chooses to stop watching. And this raises the most difficult question of all. Did these measures actually make us safer? The TSA missed 95% of threats in undercover tests. NSA bulk data collection was later found by independent reviews to have stopped 0 major terrorist attacks. In other words, the loss of liberty didn't necessarily buy security, it bought the illusion of security. That's the paradox of post-9/11 America. The more safety we demanded, the more fragile our freedom became. And the more freedoms we gave away, the harder they became to get back. 24 years later, the rubble is gone, but the shadow of 9/11 is still with us. The Patriot Act, the TSA, the NSA, some measures visible, some invisible, all born out of fear, all still shaping our daily lives. The towers fell in a single morning. But the surveillance state they left behind, that's forever. And that leaves us with the question, How much freedom are we willing to trade for the promise of safety? And what happens when we realize we may never get that freedom back? If you found this breakdown thought-provoking, this is what we do here at Info Inquisitive. Dig deep into the scandals, the psychology, and the systems that shape our world. So if you want more deep dives like this, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next investigation. And tell us in the comments, what moment in history, what scandal, what cultural shift do you think we should dig into next? Because here, the rabbit hole never ends. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.